Welcome to Stock Issues of Policy Advocacy Part 4, Cure. The cure, as illustrated by the fun little bottle over there, is the third of the four stock issues and the fourth in this series of videos. You should have already watched the overview of stock issues, the ill and the blame. This one is going to focus on the cure. When it comes around to policy advocacy, the cure is the proposed policy or the solution or the solvency. These are all some various terms that we're going to use. I include this diagram mostly for fun, but also because it illustrates that some problem solving is simple. If something isn't moving and it should, we fix it with WD-40. If something is moving and it shouldn't, we fix it with duct tape. It would be nice if this simplistic solution could work for all of our policies. Most of the policies that you are going to advocate for this class, and certainly most of the policies that you will see being advocated in city council meetings and state legislatures and on the national agenda throughout your lifetime, are not simple solutions. It's not as simple as loosening it with WD-40 or reattaching it with duct tape. Complex problems, by their very nature, require complex solutions. And that's why public policy is the tricky and complex thing that it is. One thing that can try and help you for the purposes of this assignment, you're going to be giving a relatively short, 6, maybe 8-minute speech advocating a public policy. I do not anticipate that you can solve the world's problems in those 6 to 8 minutes. But can we make a dent? Can we focus on one particular aspect of a policy that if we implemented this proposed solution, the world could potentially be a better place? Now that gets really complex, and that's something that we'll look at in the cost-benefit portion. But recognize that in reality, coming up with solutions to complex problems is a very difficult thing, and we have complex solutions that are necessary. Still, for the purposes of this assignment, narrow your topic, give us a specific ill, identify one blame for that, and then show how one solution could be the cure to that problem. All right, so once we get around to advocating a cure for a public policy, or a cure in the form of a public policy, we need to recognize that all solutions are going to include two elements: an agent, the person who's going to be doing it, and the action, what specifically that agent is going to be doing. Now, for my class, there are the two different assignments of a public policy speech and an audience action speech. For the audience action speech, which is not the one you're doing next, the agent is the individual people in the class that you're going to try to motivate those of us who are in the room listening to your speech to do something that might solve some sort of a problem. And again, that could be a societal problem. We should donate to the food shelter, or it could be an individual problem. You should adopt a vegetarian diet to be more healthy, right? Those are the sorts of audience action, audience as agent speeches that we're expecting later in the semester. For the public policy speech, we're now talking about a solution that we need to agree on as some sort of community, or that our elected representatives make some sort of a decision. So what is the policy going to be? So the agent are the people who are in the position to enact the policy. So the agent would be like the Ogden City Council, or the Utah State Legislature, or the United States Congress, right? That's going to be the agent. I don't know if any of you have ever sat around and played the let's solve all of the world's problems in our discussion game. But I had one person that I knew that when we would talk about things, he would always talk about how they need to do something. They ought to do this. They ought to do that. And my response was always, who the hell is they? Right? Who is the they? The they is going to be the decision-making body that can implement this sort of policy. The action is what they're going to be doing. So we need to figure out the agent first, and then we figure out what they're going to be doing in terms of implementing a policy, changing a law, amending a law, repealing a law. So we have some sort of agent and some sort of specific action. And if your solution doesn't have both of those things, it is an inadequate solution, and on its face, we're going to say, hey, you're not really advocating any policy. Part of the way that's going to play out is in the phrasing of your policy thesis statement. So for the public policy speech, your thesis statement, which I'll expect to hear in the introduction, should sound a lot like this. Some decision-making body should, some legislative verb, some specific policy. Notice that the only word that's really required in there is should. And should is the key term in a persuasive speech, particularly a policy speech. Your audience action speech, the informative speech that you just gave, the key word in the informative thesis statement was is. Some topic is whatever you describe the topic to be. And all you had to do was convince us that a certain state of affairs existed, and you were informing us about that state of affairs. For the public policy speech, you are advocating a change, and so the should becomes the key part of that. So we start with some decision-making body. This is your agent. Weber State University Administration should. The state of Utah should. United States Congress should. I've had some students, the United Nations should. Ogden City Council should. What is the public that's going to be the agent of this public policy? And then they should some legislative verb. Implement, pass, amend, repeal. Right? Notice that these are all kind of legislative verbs. What are they going to do? And then some public policy. So what is it that we're actually going to do? So the state of Utah should repeal the Zion Curtain policy that you have to mix drinks behind a wall. Weber State University should change the way that parking passes are given to give more preference to veterans. The United States Congress should abolish the Electoral College. Right? Notice how we're phrasing these sorts of policy statements in terms of some decision-making body should, some legislative verb, some public policy. So when I'm looking for a clear statement of thesis in your introduction, it needs to follow this pattern. One of the things that makes this particular assignment interesting is who is your audience. And again, you're still speaking to the other students in your class. So when you do audience analysis, think about, okay, what are the other people in my audience going to think, believe, find important? What problems are they going to care about, not care about, those sorts of things. But we are going to pretend that our audience rules the world. So you are convincing the people in our class, but we're going to assume that the people in our class can tell the United Nations or Weber State Administration or Weber County School District what they should do. Hopefully that makes sense, and we're going to kind of play this pretend game, and we can laugh evilly as we play the game of ruling the world. One of the challenges that you will have as the advocate of a policy is demonstrating the effectiveness of the policy. The main thing you do to pull this off is having sufficient evidence and support that this solution will work, that the cure will be a remedy for the ill, right? So how do you prove that? Well, what kind of evidence do you have that supports it? Do you have some expert testimony, perhaps? Do we evoke some sort of logical appeal that makes sense? One of the most widely used areas for advocating public policy, and this happens all of the time at a lot of different levels, is what is called parallel reasoning. Parallel reasoning is the argument that we make that because it worked for some group, it will work for the group in question, provided that those two groups are similar in some sort of respect. Let me give you some examples of that. Let's suppose we want to implement some type of Weber State University policy. Well, let's look around and see whether or not this is a good policy. Well, they do it at BYU, Brigham Young University. Should we do it at Weber State? Because if it worked for BYU, it ought to work for us. Yeah, maybe not so much. We've got issues of private school versus public school. We have issues of size. We have issues of people predominantly living on campus versus commuting to campus. A lot of things are going to make that work not so well. But if we were to say Boise State University, if it worked there, would it work for Weber State University? Okay, we've got two universities in moderately sized metropolitan areas, a lot of commuter students. If it works for them, will it work for us? Then maybe it would tend to work. So parallel reasoning is the idea. If it worked for them, it'll work for us because we are similar in the areas that matter. So those are some things that we look at when we do parallel reasoning. I've talked about this to some extent, but to make it absolutely clear, we need to tie our cure stock issue back to the earlier stock issues of blame and ill. I say problem on the slide, but that's just another word for ill. When we talked about blame, we talked about that there are barriers that exist, either structural or attitudinal barriers. How does this proposed policy overcome those barriers? How does it resolve the blame? And so again, we talked about how blame is a really interesting sticking point, and it's hard to straight up say that one thing causes another thing, but the idea here is that we can resolve the blame. Again, think to the medical analogy. If I have a flu, then an antibiotic might be prescribed so it can kill the influenza bug, and then I can become healthy. But if I prescribe antibiotics for a cold caused by a virus, it's not going to give me the intended benefit and might actually make things worse and make my body, or make the, we can overdo the antibiotics, and that's not a good thing, is what I'm trying to say. Again, how does it relieve the problem? How do the ills go away because of this cure? If the cure doesn't solve for the ills and relieve the pain and suffering and whatever was the problem that you identified, it's not a very good cure. So again, as we look at its place in the stock issues, the stock issue of cure goes back to this idea of relieving the ill by resolving the blame. Question is whether or not the cure is worse than the disease, and that's the issue that we'll look at as we look at cost benefit, and again, presentation number 6, how we use the stock issues to organize our speeches.